Welcome back. Here we are, opening up part 3, early adulthood. So, who's an adult? We don't have significant rites of passages in the United States. Certain subcultures do. Hispanics, 15-year-old is considered an adult, right? And you have your quinceañera, your quince. If you're Jewish, age 13, you have a bar or bar mitzvah. And these are rituals that are designed to say you've moved from childhood to adulthood, right? In the United States, though, other than that, we don't necessarily have a lot of rituals that indicate now you're an adult. So it can be difficult to determine when one becomes an adult. Some markers may include marriage, but that kind of, might be up for grabs if less people are getting married. Having a full-time job. But when we look now, even these are becoming outdated because many of us are being forced into a gig economy, right? So it's not a full-time job. It might be a collection of part-time jobs that are relatively transient and always changing, right? Economic independence. And that's one of the most solid markers of adulthood. But at the same time, when we look at the economy in which we're embedded now, economic independence might be tough for an awful lot of people, especially when we look at minimum wage in this country. It doesn't really allow for economic independence as it has in the past. Self-responsibility, okay, that's a good marker of adulthood, but in what domains, you might ask? And what might be some other markers of adulthood? So you can kind of consider that question. I think one of the markers of adulthood, kind of maybe a hidden one to a certain extent, is when my mom said, "Get out of the house." I mean, she was nice about it, and she put me up in an apartment with my first and last month's rent. But from that moment on, I was on my own. And one of the weird things was I got sick, right? I got sick and I developed bronchitis. I had to find my own doctor. And I had to arrange for payments to my own doctor, right? And I was poor. I had a minimum wage job at that point in time, full-time. But I was so poor I was able to apply in California for Medicaid, right? So I had to find a doctor that accepted Medicaid. And later on, I found a job, right, that provided health insurance. But so that kind of might be one marker of adulthood, if you will. We'll see what happens with the ACA, because you guys are able to ride on your parents' insurance to age 24 as a part of the ACA mandate. But it seems a lot of forces, in government now are trying to roll back or demolish the ACA. So who knows what happens to you guys and your health insurance and your relationship with your doctor down the road. That remains to be seen. Cognitive development in early adulthood. Some researchers disagree with Piaget, right? Believe that thinking in early adulthood becomes more realistic and pragmatic, not just more the same as Piaget would suggest. Post-formal thought, then, is this idea that the thought that thought can become reflective, relativistic, and contextual. So now we've gone into conceptual thinking, right, with formal thought, but now we kind of roll back on that and become more nuanced in our thinking, that sometimes we have to be practical. That high ideals and conceptual thinking is fine, but it doesn't necessarily pay the bills. So we maybe start making some compromises in that regard based on the context in which we find ourselves. So it becomes provisional. And provisional thinking was, well, okay, if this, then that, and that's a provision. But if not this, if something else, then this other thing. That is, we begin to become very flexible in if-then approach to the world. This is kind of being realistic, and often we're kind of shaken out of our adolescent idealism, young adult idealism, and say, look, we got to be realistic here. So. Open to emotions and subjective, and the world is subjective. I had a student join me in office hours today, and she said, so, because she's worried about the paper and the instructions, and she says, this isn't very detailed, and I said, no, it's not. And she said, but there's really no right answers, and I said, no. there aren't, right? So this is a subjective assignment, and I look more at effort than I do correctness, if you will. What is the effort that someone invested in thinking about this? It's not what conclusion did someone come to, but what is the manner of thought they used to arrive at that conclusion? And that's subjective, right? And some students have a tough time with that because they want a very specific, like, checklist rubric. Some teachers will supply that. I tend to craft more subjective assignments. And if that is not your taste, I'm sorry, but it's my style, right? So that's, and notice, this is something else we learn in college. You go to all these different classes, these teachers have different styles and different expectations. Open to emotions and learning about emotions and experiencing them. So early adulthood then, let's say, late teens, early 20s, and last through the 30s. Notice how vague that is because we don't have the markers as we described before. It's a time of establishing personal and economic independence to a certain degree, right? Developing a career. And that one is pretty solid. Most of us are looking to, right, kind of develop a career because it's so important to our identity, especially in the 20th and 21st century. Selecting a mate. Learning to live with someone in an intimate way, and this is beyond sexual intimacy, because sexual intimacy is relatively easy and straightforward, but interpersonal intimacy, sharing ideas, sharing thoughts, sharing space, right? These are all elements of intimacy that need to be incorporated into the new relationships. Perhaps starting a family, whether people choose to do that or not, right? Note, though, if we go back in time 200 or 300 years, that wouldn't be considered a choice. That would be considered a responsibility, right? And expected. Not necessarily anymore. So, and then rearing children. And that is difficult in and of itself. So, adjustment strategies for successful aging. And notice that college is a time, or post-high school is a time where people pick up a lot of the bad habits, right? Unfortunately, some folks who are at Ohio State will become acquainted with drinking. And for some of those folks who become acquainted with drinking, they will become devoted to drinking. And so alcoholism has its roots often in the college experience, right? So don't abuse alcohol, don't smoke, right? Now I sound like Mr. Mackey, right? Smoking is bad, okay? Drinking is bad, okay? From South Park, right? But don't abuse alcohol and don't smoke. And notice I'm not saying don't drink alcohol, I'm saying don't abuse it, right? Don't smoke. There's little good that can come from cigarette smoking. It's just a horrible habit. It's highly addictive. I met a lot of people at Columbus State who were in recovery. They were heroin users, and they quit using heroin. And in that subset of people who quit using heroin, I also met a lot of people, some people who quit cigarette smoking. And most people who quit smoking cigarettes and quit smoking and quit using heroin said that it was easier to quit using heroin than it was to quit smoking. So consider that. And tobacco companies have a long history of introducing additional components into tobacco that increase the addictive capacity of tobacco. So let's not smoke. I don't think vaping is going to be the miracle cure either, right? Exercise regularly, avoid being overweight. I'm going to skip that one right now because I'm a poor example. Yes, I'm exercising again since we began this class because I thought that's something I need to do adjustment-wise, and if I'm going to talk to you about 9 wellness dimensions, I better frickin' participate in it too, because I won't be able to stand myself being a hypocrite, right? Overweight, I'm going to let the weight take care of itself one thing at a time. Be well educated. Read. Travel. Expose yourself to other people and other ideas. Go to talks. Do whatever it is. Use your intellectual skills. Practice this stuff. Keep your mind flexible, right? Develop coping skills. And we've talked about that in the stress lecture, right? So as we move through this course, notice that we're going to start returning to things that we've talked about in the past in kind of a summary fashion. So coping skills, right? Have good friends and or a loving partner, and nourish those relationships, and take from them what is meaningful to you, and give and give and give more as you move through it. Well, we're accelerating our pace here. We go to middle adulthood. What do you think? The hostas didn't look all that good this year. This is a picture from 2 years prior. I'm not sure why the hostas didn't. I think it was too hot for the hostas this year. But beautiful flowers. And they grow so well in Ohio. So it's part of my gardening adjustment, is learning what grows well here. Grow good tomatoes here. When I lived in Salem, Oregon, there was a year or two where I didn't get any tomatoes, right? They just remained green. It was never warm enough and sunny enough for them to ripen. So you got to adjust to your surroundings when you're a gardener. So adult periods of development, middle adulthood, loosely defined as maybe from 40 to about 60. That sucks. I'd say 40 to 70, so I don't have to be an old adult yet, but unfortunately 62. I think I'm on the wrong side of this. Middle adulthood is a time of expanding personal, social involvement and responsibility. And we're called upon to do so. So we may join organizations. We may take a more active role in our employment. We may be mentoring junior employees. Or involved in maybe our children's activities. Right? We assist the next generation in becoming competent, mature individuals, if all goes well. We reach and maintaining satisfaction in a career. And this is kind of the peak career years, are 40 to 60, when we're really consolidating the gains we made in our careers and really coming into our own. Especially true of my wife, as she moved and she became a paralegal, and she started working in the law firm, and then she left the law firm and went to Nationwide. And now, man, she's a mover and a shaker in her realm in Nationwide. She's become a go-to person, and she's highly respected and super well paid, right? And her ability to craft legal opinions is really blossomed, right? The beginning to care for elders, and my wife and I have gone through this. We were caring for my mom. We care for her dad to a certain extent, but that's long distance. But caring for my mom was long distance until we moved her out here to Ohio, and had her in the memory care unit. She passed last November. But this is something that we need to do, right? So during middle adulthood, you're likely to experience the death of people who are close to you. Friends especially, but older family members start to depart, right? And that was true of my father, who died in 96, and then my mom, who's died in 2019. Recognize that the time in life is finite. And that's kind of a scary thought. I remember when I hit, when you hit like 45, 50 is a nice round number, so let's play with that. And you say, okay, so if my life expectancy is 77, right? An American male, average life expectancy is 77, so let's just go with the average. When I hit 50, I say, well, 2/3 of my life is over and 1/3 remains. And that's kind of a sobering thought, because, the majority, and now I'm looking at 62, let's say I live to 77, I only got 15 years left. Life is finite. If there's shit that I want to get done, I better get on the stick, right? Because it's not like I have this endless amount of time. Now, I could live to be 94. But then I could be one of those poor sons of bitches who dies the month after they retire, too. So we begin to appreciate that life is finite. So the life themes involve our effort then to cultivate some kind of meaningful, optimal experiences. And one thing that I'm so fortunate and so thankful for is the career path that I chose or stumbled into, or however the hell you want to put it. Because it gives me a feeling of meaning that I can contribute to your education. And hopefully what we learn together, what we discuss together, will allow you to make even better life choices than I made. Right? So that's one of my hopes. The life themes are sometimes described in terms of narratives, the stories we tell and construct. And I can look backward now and see a very cohesive narrative in how I've gotten to where I am. It was a circuitous route, but in all it makes sense, right? Yeah. One thing that many of us unfortunately have to deal with is this being in the sandwich generation, and beginning in the mid-40s, right? That sometimes we have children to care for, but we have elderly parents to care for, and that's why they call it the sandwich generation, because here you are, the meat, trying to get business done with the two slices of bread, your children and your parents, right? So you might be a continued financial source for children, and you might have to start taking over some of the responsibilities for your parents. Now, I'm very thankful that my mother was well situated financially. So we were lucky that we did not need to contribute our own finances to her care, that she had it taken care of, that it was okay. But that's not always the case. And if your parents are not preparing, this is something to consider, that in fact that may affect you, and it's some serious decision making. That is, if my parents aren't taking care of themselves, if they're not providing for their own retirement, if their lodging is not solid, that is, they don't own their home or whatever, what exactly will their expectations be, right, of me as their child? And these are things to consider. It might not just be time, but it might be money as well. And think about then how this can lead to really high levels of stress, both emotional and financial. Best to go in with eyes open, though. What is this going to look like? Have they prepared? If they haven't prepared, then what am I going to feel responsible to do? No, that's bad news, but nearly 40% of those aged 35 to 54 report extreme levels of stress, right? Compared to 29% of 18 to 34-year-olds and 25% of those older than that period of time. So this is a stressful time. There's a lot of positives, there's a lot of gains, there's a lot of satisfaction to be had, but also it can be a lot of stress as well. So let's talk about cognitive development in middle adulthood. Cattell and Horn argue that some intellectual abilities decline in middle age, but others increase. So the crystallized intelligence, right, your accumulated information and verbal skills, that increases in middle adulthood. That is, you can continue to acquire knowledge, content knowledge, vocabulary, etc. But fluid intelligence, the ability to reason abstractly, might begin to decline in middle adulthood. Now, these declines might be so subtle as to not be noticeable if they exist at all. But we can also see where they may be more profound and affect people's decisions in a serious way. And notice there's a whole host of people sitting out there waiting to prey on the elderly in their cognitive decline. So, Shea found two intellectual abilities: numerical ability, perceptual speed decline in middle age. Well, perceptual speed, right, okay, so reaction time, etc., goes down. And the ability to do mathematics tends to decline as well. I remember in late adulthood, my mother lost her capacity to do math almost whatsoever, right? So, if we went out to dinner, what she loved to do, then she would ask me, what should I tip, right? And, I don't know, about 6-7 years before she passed, maybe 7-8 years, my wife was essentially taking care of my mother's finances, had taken over the bill paying and all that stuff for the most part, because my mom just wasn't capable of doing the math anymore. Shea found the four intellectual abilities, though, so it's not all bad news. Vocabulary, verbal memory, inductive reasoning, spatial orientation can improve in early adulthood. And that just comes with the acquisition of these talents. So let's take a look then. What do we see? The stages, according to Shea Willis, right? The acquisitive, achieving, the responsible, executive, reorganization, reintegrative, and legacy creating. You can see along the timeline of age. Consider these, but I would prefer that you consider these in comparison to Erickson, which is where we're going here pretty soon. So, the midlife crisis, Levinson, right, interviewed middle-aged men and identified 4 major conflicts. And I think this will apply more to women as time goes on as well, as we become more gender egalitarian, my supposition at least. Being young versus being old. And I'm old now. I ain't young, and that's something you got to come to grips with, right? That's just the way it is. Being destructive versus being constructive, and this is like, to what extent am I supporting societal structures, supporting my family, supporting environmental issues? To what extent does my life really then yield a benefit for those around me in the planet, or to what extent am I trashing the place? Being masculine versus being feminine. And men move increasingly kind of towards feminine stereotypic qualities as they age, right? So this kind of perceived loss of masculinity, whatever the hell that means. And then being attached to others, being separated from them. And this is something that we often see as our friends, family begin to die. We begin to lose our connections. Right? So these are components of the midlife crisis. Now, what's up with the midlife crisis? Well, maybe only 10% of people actually experience what would be a full blown midlife crisis. And we're going to review the term midlife crisis when we get to Erickson at the end of the lecture. I think I want to break here as a convenient part here, and we'll go into part 4.